In the first video, we covered the basics of what Roger Griffin's definition is and how it's used to identify generic fascism. And here we will talk about its strengths and how it avoids the many failures other attempts have made at trying to define and identify the political phenomenon. Roger Griffin's definition of fascism is a genius of political ideology whose mythic core in its various permutations is a palingenetic form of populist ultranationalism. Notice how within this it doesn't name any specifics about how to carry this out economically, aesthetically, or even demographically, as opposed to other definitions or methods that identify characteristics of specific movements as inherent to the ideology itself, when these are often at most accidental. Another understandable fallacy is to assume that my theory plays down the importance of overt traits of a fascist regime or movement, such as its anti-socialism, Derringist economics and social policy, imperialism, militarism, leader cult, or the compromise with traditional conservatism. However important these may be at the level of concrete history, my theory relegates them to accidental aspects of fascism which can arise when an attempt is made to realize the fascist utopia, and have no place in the fascist minimum. This is a major point of difference with Stanley Payne's tripartite typological description and single-sentence definition, both of which refer to ideology, organization, and stylistic aspects of fascism, which I believe to be contingent on the peculiar ethos of the interwar period rather than intrinsic to fascism itself, and hence timeless. This is specifically true of such features as the leader cult, paramilitarism, theatrical politics, territorial expansionism, and corporatist economics. This sets Roger Griffin's method apart, as many often assume that interwar characteristics are a necessary aspect of fascism. This results in assigning an accidental trait or an assorted list of them and applying it either to the ideology's generic type or simply making a list of general characteristics without acknowledging or even giving credence to the idea that a generic type exists. For example, Stanley Payne includes militarism in his list of characteristics since its usage in the interwar and war periods, when this is more so a means extending from the core than inherent in it. Militarism's relation to fascism is merely the outcome of interpreting it as a necessary means to defend and regenerate the national community from degeneracy. The tactics and methods for defense are tangential to the time period and what is considered needed for the alternation to preserve itself. This can be in the form of using party politics and paramilitary squads, or simply a lone wolf acting as a single agent to try and spark an awakening. The existence of armed forces themselves could be framed as a temporary measure that won't be needed once the ideal society is finally secured, that an organic peace has finally been established. When framing militarism as inherent, it's common to extend irredentism from this as well, as both Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy pursued territorial expansion. However, this too is an extension. Which lands are considered a part of the alternation, the method for harnessing the territory, and whether other alternations exist outside them is going to rely on the individual permutation. Many post-war fascist variants have had a specific focus on unfolding and shedding away territorial ambitions for isolated regionalism. Another commonly listed item is corporatism, framed as the inherent economic model for fascism. This is due to its prevalence in the interwar period and more specifically Mussolini's usage of corporatist economics. Corporatism is the organization of society by corporate groups such as agricultural, labor, military, business, scientific, or guild associations on the basis of their common interests. This can manifest in many different ways and for many reasons. Put simply, corporatism is class compromise, where social arrangements between different classes of various levels of wealth and power negotiate to reach agreements they both see as satisfactory. Most unions are corporatist, as is the social spending and welfare statism. This developed in contrast to the theories of class conflict in Marxism. During the interwar period, there were many variations of corporatist economics developed and used under authoritarian regimes. The fascist variant, which was seen as being founded by Benito Mussolini, he used it to establish class collaboration, which ideologically acted as a synergetic cohesion and maintenance of hierarchy. This served as an alternate to class struggle and ordered state relations according to how he viewed it would best preserve and restore the health of the nation. In short, what makes corporatism fascist is when it's used in the service of promoting an ultranational rebirth. Corporatism outside this context is not fascist, and saying otherwise would be erroneous and ignorant of the different ways in which these things have developed. There was no single fascist model to be adopted beyond the assertion that the economy should promote the rebirth of the alternation in the first phase and subsequently sustain its newfound greatness, making attempts to generalize hazardous. The non-fascist variants of authoritarian corporatism include a type of fascistized Catholic corporatism, as it based itself on an interpretation of the Catholic social teaching while incorporating fascistic elements. There were also forms of corporatism used by authoritarian regimes that weren't Catholic, but nonetheless many of them were also conservative in some of their nature, as well as containing many fascistized elements. This was used by many para-fascist regimes that used the aesthetics, rhetoric, and top-down management styles of fascist regimes, but excluded the core of revolutionary organic nationalism for preserving conservative institutions and values. The specific dynamics of para-fascism will be explored much further in the next video.
Corporatism further developed in the post-war age. From 1945 to 1971, most of the states of the world adhered to a corporatist model. There was social spending, unions played a major part in negotiations, and aid was sent from the first to the third world. Starting in the 70s, neoliberalism was adopted at world scale in order to replace corporatism. Unions were virtually outlawed and went into decline. Social spending was cut, and aid to the third world was replaced with debt peonage by the IMF and World Bank.
The most astounding and perplexing of so-called characteristics to give fascism is anti-intellectualism, irrational, incoherent, and lacking a general ideology, hence why people make long grocery lists and not single-sentence definitions in the first place. Characterizing or defining fascism as irrational doesn't help anyone understand its motivations or internal logic. It's extreme reductionism that leaves nothing in the way of an explanation. This framing removes agency, imagination, and thought from fascism and paints it as either the puppet of capital, as seen with Marxist definitions, which we will explore later on, and or the random whimsies of a madman, as they follow his random ravings as they are sent onto the battlefield running headfirst into open fire screaming, "I have no idea why I'm doing this." Benito Mussolini and Adolf Hitler had expansive worldviews and drawn-out plans for what their vision of an ideal society was. The reason for the Holocaust wasn't for some random, unintentional, sporadic, and irrational thrill, but to achieve in his mind the establishment of a reborn society through the cleansing of unhealthy elements to allow for the organic members to prosper and flourish. You can say this reasoning is irrational and evil, and while it is, to define it that way removes understanding the reasonings and axioms by which this thought process and its actions come about. This runs alongside a dangerously close way many Holocaust deniers used to try and remove Nazi ideology from their actions, arguing that the regime had no intention of committing mass genocide when this is overtly false. Jewish people are accused of being the primary enemy and perpetrators of cultural and moral decay. This accusation that fascism lacks reasoning extends into accusing fascism as hating intellectualism and academia. While it's true that fascists hate intellectuals and thus the institutions they inhabit, accusing the philosophies taught in them as causing cultural ennui, it should also be noted that the fascists themselves often form their own intellectualism, as in creating authorities and institutions considered natural that rival and teach against the unnatural ones. This produces literature, films, music, art, and other things that represent in their mind as rooted in the alternation. This forms an opposing cultural landscape they struggle to secure. Listed among Umberto Eco's famous 14 points is machismo, which is strong or aggressive masculine pride. Eco further expands on this, saying that fascists hold both disdain for women and intolerance and condemnation of non-standard sexual habits, from chastity to homosexuality. It's easy to understand fascism as inherently male-centered and patriarchal, considering socioeconomic conditions lead fascist movements down this path, but it's theoretically possible to have a matriarchal and female-centered fascism. Even within patriarchal conditions, many fascists themselves framed gender politics in a much different way than the conservatives of their time. The British Union of Fascists is probably the leading case in this regard, as at a point it had about 25% female membership, drawing in many former suffragettes. The reason for this among many were that they viewed the BUF's economic policies as offering true equality, as the movement itself insisted that it would not require women to return to domesticity, and that a corporatist state would ensure representation for housewives, even guaranteeing equal wages for women, removing the marriage bar that restricted the employment of married women, offering support for new mothers within the movement due to concerns regarding failing birth rates, but also offering birth control at the same time. Of course, this was framed around preserving the health of the alternation, not any genuine sense of feminism or actual gender equality. Notable female members of the British Union of Fascists were Mary Sophia Allen, who joined the United Kingdom's Women's Police Volunteers in 1914 and continued to be active in that organization through its many name changes and developments. She was sympathetic towards and even met many fascist leaders like Mussolini, Hitler, and Göring. When meeting Hitler in 1934, she discussed the issues of women's role in the police force. becoming captivated and developing an admiration for him. In 1939, she publicly joined the BUF. Allen was notable for advocating for the modernization of the police force and its incorporation of women. Another was Canadian suffragette, 1922 UK Socialist parliamentary candidate, and arsonist Mary Richardson. Active in the suffragette bombing and arson campaign of 1912 to 1914, even awarded the Hunger Strike Medal for Valor by the Women's Social and Political Union. In 1934, she joined the BUF as she believed it was the only path to a Greater Britain, as she was attracted to the black shirts because I saw in them the courage, the action, the loyalty, the gift of service, and the ability to serve which I had known in the suffragette movement. Rising quickly within the ranks and by 1934 became chief organizer for the women's section of the party. However, within 2 years she would leave due to disillusionment with its sincerity in regards to its policies towards women. Broader than this specific case is that fascists redefined gender relations through the commitment of the national community and viewing this with a sense of heroism, encouraging women to take on the mindset that they were full members within the society and that they too formed a part of the organic whole. Fascist Italy and Nazi Germany encouraged women to participate in mass organization activities to affirm this mindset, even though they were often barred from assuming official positions, although of course exceptions existed. Mothers were given a sense that they were a part of a heroic sacrifice to produce for the future of the alternation. This framed motherhood in a uniquely heroic and politically affirmative light. None of this is to say that these regimes weren't sexist, but to add the nuances and reasons behind why a woman would join a fascist movement. It's all too common to erase women's experiences from radical politics, especially in regards to fascism, as it's assumed that no woman would ever have any reason to join, which reduces agency in the political imagination of such a case. Particularly erroneous is the notion that fascism simply wanted to return women to the roles envisioned for them by traditional conservatives. Certainly, once married, women were encouraged to increase the birth rates by a combination of sustained propaganda idolizing motherhood, in Italy with the echoes of the cult of the Madonna, financial incentives for taking married women out of the workplace, and medals for large families. But fascist natalism under the Deuce and the Führer exhibited a distinctively modernizing and anti-conservative element. The innovations introduced to improve the demographic health of the nation, such as state investments in maternity assistance and infant medicine, anticipated aspects of female health care, familiar in modern democratic welfare states, but without the liberal emphasis on individualism or the rights of the woman. From this, it isn't impossible to conceive of a woman as a leader of a fascist movement, considering the criteria for leadership is based on the person's commitment and organic membership in the ultranational identity. Even more, the possibility of viewing their role as more important to it and thus given a superior status within that society. Extending further is the acceptance of homosexuality and transgender people, so long as they are framed as healthy and organic elements of that ultranational society. Real-life examples, although incredibly niche, are phenomenons like Transtracerism. The primary issue with using a list of characteristics to describe fascism is that it limits our understanding of how it can adapt and mutate beyond these specific traits while using the definable core to keep it grounded, creating a broad but specific method for identifying both interwar and post-war fascist variants. To try and help people visualize the difference between the generic, the definitional traits that create the minimum conditions that define a political ideology apart from others, and the accidental, characteristics that aren't a part of the minimum but rather extend from them to form a variation of said political ideology. Being has created a simple visual that will be called the general accidental model. The general, which here will be the generic type of fascism, which has been identified as a palingenetic form of populist ultranationalism, and the accidental, characteristics used or identified with fascist regimes that extend from this generic type, such as the many that were previously discussed, such as militarism, irrationalism, which often comes from fascism being described as militaristic, corporatism, Deringism can often follow from prescribing corporatist economics to fascism, incoherent as in defining fascism as having an irrational character due to its internal logic not meaning a standard of rationality, or its own ideological justification containing contradictions or inconsistencies. This extends into anti-intellectualism, and even sometimes claiming that fascism lacks a generic type to begin with. Machismo, which extends into patriarchy and homophobia. Other generic characteristics, such as the party dictatorship, are also framed as definitional, which discounts the many post-war variations that have given up on party politics in favor of different forms of authoritarian arrangements to facilitate the ultranational rebirth. With this visual and its description in mind, we will move on to the Marxist attempts at trying to define and understand fascism. Not using primary sources and abstaining from an empathic method to try and understand fascists from their own viewpoint caused many to see the political ideology from a detached point of view. which made the analysis blindsided and paralyzed, the consequence of a completely removed perspective. This is the problem with many Marxist analysis of fascism. Instead of identifying an ideological core and generic type that's unique and autonomous, they instead view it as a capitalism in reaction. The two definitional methods that sprung up from this were the agent theory and the Bonapartist theory. Agent theory comes from the 1922 Fourth World Congress of the Comintern, which lays down the Soviet Orthodox interpretation of fascism. It concluded that fascism's function was to act as capital's direct agent of class repression and the force through which the bourgeoisie conducted its offensive against the proletariat. Its paramilitary soldiers, acting as the white guards of counter-revolution, at the same time sought to gain a working-class following through the use of social demagoguery. Basically, fascism is nothing more than the counter-revolution in service of the bourgeoisie against socialists and the working class. This was the official dogma used by the Comintern until its last Congress. We also see the development of social fascism within Comintern dogma.
The idea of social fascism comes from the complicated history of socialism and communism in Germany. Before the socialists and communists split, the socialist parties of Europe, including the German Social Democratic Party, were Marxist parties. Engels even had a hand in the founding of German social democracy. During World War I, all the socialist parties, to the horror of the International Socialist Bureau that governed them, sold out their principles of working-class internationalism and supported the First World War. This caused many on the left of social democracy to observe that it had become a bureaucratized machine of uninspired reformism. In Germany, this was a group around Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht. They ended up forming a faction called the Spartacists that broke openly with the Social Democratic Party. Eventually, the tension led to an ill-fated uprising on the part of the Spartacists against the Social Democratic government that formed after the war forced out the Kaiser. The Spartacists were brutally repressed, and right-wing militias at the behest of the Social Democrats murdered Luxemburg and Liebknecht. The Spartacist faction ended up forming the Communist Party of Germany, KPD. For a time, Paul Levy led the KPD close to the Social Democrats by turning it into a similar electoral party that viewed socialism as something that one fights for peacefully in government. The KPD became part of the Comintern, and after Levy, Ernst Thälmann became the leader of the party. He was much more militant than Levy. The Comintern's reaction to the rise of fascism was that it was a sign of capitalism in decay, and that really the Social Democrats, who the communists broke with after 1917, were much more insidious in that they deceived workers into believing that they could solve the workers' problems. In this sense, the Comintern called the Social Democrats social fascists. Under Thälmann's leadership and with Comintern direction, the KPD refused to make any alliance with the Social Democrats against the Nazis, and instead joined the Nazis in a chorus of mocking condemnations of the Social Democrats. There was even a joint communist and Nazi labor strike. Many surmise that if the KPD just bit the bullet and made the alliance, they could have stopped the Nazis. I am very skeptical of this conclusion myself, but at the very least, it was clearly not advisable to make this informal common cause with the Nazis.
Bonapartist theory differed from agent theory in that it gave fascism a degree of autonomy, but within the range of serving bourgeoisie interests. This observation can be found within Marxism as early as 1921 with Giovanni Zabordi. He suggested that fascism might be an autonomous force that is used and exploited by the bourgeoisie. This observation further developed into Bonapartist theory, which served as the alternative to the Comintern doctrine. Why is it called Bonapartist theory? Because it draws from Marx's definition and analysis of Bonapartism that he wrote in his essay, The 18 Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte, where he portrays the reign of both Napoleon I and III as forms of autonomous military dictatorships, which, however popular, crushed progressive working-class movements and thereby were able to serve bourgeoisie interests while simultaneously retaining power over the bourgeoisie. Notable thinkers that used variations of this were former Comintern thinker August Thalheimer, Otto Bauer, Leon Trotsky, and Antonio Gramsci. Thalheimer saw fascism as a related phenomenon to Bonapartism, viewing them both as forms of an open dictatorship of the bourgeois. Bauer gives fascism a degree of autonomy from the bourgeois, but remarks that it's a symptom of wider civilizational crisis that war, not class struggle, would resolve. Trotsky, who is far more influential than the former two, wrote in his 1934 article Bonapartism and Fascism that there were two forms of Bonapartism. Preventive Bonapartism, also called pre-fascist, where the bourgeois encourages government suspension of democratic processes to ward off the dangers of a fascist takeover, as in the presidency of Hindenburg and presumably Mussolini's parliamentary premiership before creating the fascist state. And the Bonapartism of fascist origin, which happens when reaction goes from a a populist national form into a more hardened militaristic state that imposes control over the whole society, including the paramilitary forces of the bourgeois that brought it into power. Although he criticizes Stalin and the Comintern for their indiscriminate labeling of fascism, he shares their axiom that fascism can only be the government of finance capital. Trotsky even went as far as to assert that the Nazis acquired the program in order to assume power, but power serves Hitler not at all for the purpose of fuming the program. His tasks are assigned him by monopoly capital. In 1933's What is National Socialism, he robs the Nazis of ideological autonomy and even much distinction from the bourgeois, as earlier in the same essay, he goes as far as to assert that Hitler's nation is the mythological shadow of the petty bourgeoisie itself, a pathetic delirium of a thousand-year Reich. Lastly, Gramsci, who argued that Mussolini was more effective at taking advantage of Italy's post-1918 societal crisis than the Marxists were by proclaiming the imminent creation of a new nationalist and ethical order in which it deliberately established a form of Caesarism through channeling charismatic energies into its leader. This same analysis was applied to Hitler to explain the 1929-33 German crisis, where once again left revolutionary potential was blocked by superstructural forces, i.e. ideological factors such as the capitalist press, reactionary civil society, and educational society, conservative nationalism, and institutional religion. These factors for Gramsci explained how the Caesarism of Hitler, not the divided left, were able to triumph, as Hitler persuasively offered the public the goal of actualizing a reactionary and socially repressive utopia through the creation of a racial state, which was framed as a national revolution that would encompass the entire Volk, although Gramsci himself did not view it as revolutionary. For Gramsci, Bonapartism was an unprecedented form of relative independence of the executive power, and Caesarism was a channeling of charismatic energies into the person within that power. So you could think of this variation as fusing both Bonapartism and Caesarism into its taxonomy. Mussolini and Hitler exhibited a form of reactionary Caesarism, like that of Caesar and himself and Napoleon III, while Lenin and Napoleon I exhibit examples of progressive Caesarism. For Gramsci, in each of these cases, a charismatic leader helps a progressive or reactionary force come into power, but within certain compromises and limitations. To illustrate Bonapartism's general place within Marxism, Roger Griffin remarks Bonapartism provides an elegant way for Marxists to use a concept rooted in orthodox Marxist historical analysis to accommodate fascism within a scheme of history which denies it any genuine ideological novelty, populist base, or revolutionary dynamic, thus leaving progress towards the ultimate realization of a socialist society in theory unimpeded by a new ideological enemy. A characteristic feature of this term's application is that it encourages Marxists to view any fascist regime, which for them extends to most anti-communist dictatorships and racist regimes, as an emergency or exceptional state generated by the imperial forces of capitalism. It is an ad hoc solution to a crisis that might suit elements within the bourgeoisie initially and might whip up cross-class support with its populist and nationalist rhetoric, but proves inherently unstable and doomed to failure because of its internal class contradictions. The immediate issues with framing fascism this way is that it ignores fascism's potential as an anti-systemic movement and threat to the capitalist world economy. This discounts fascism as a rival revolutionary force, instead reducing it to a form of counter-revolutionary shenanigans, instead of having its own vision for an alternative modernism.
Capitalism is a world economy. This means that it is a social system that incorporates multiple regions and social structures in those regions, which is organized through exchange. World empires are systems that existed before and sometimes alongside capitalism, where there are also multiple regions and social structures incorporated. But instead of being organized on exchange, the system is organized through the bureaucracy commanding the military. In order to establish itself and survive, capitalism had to overcome multiple attempts to transform the world economy into a world empire. In the long 16th century, 1450 to 1650, as distinct from the typical rendering of the 16th century, Spain and France tried to create world empires. They not only defeated each other, but were defeated by the world economy. No state which has tried to change from one to the other since then has been successful, although one state specifically did try. Hitler had a supranational conception of his fascist project, where he wanted to create a democratic fascism, in the words of Emanuel Wallerstein. This would consist of a global elite class among whom the social arrangement would be relatively egalitarian, but this class would also be perched above everyone else who would be relegated to plebeian status. Hitler, just like in France and Spain, failed because, contrary to Marxist ideas, his project required completely transforming the world system from capitalism to something else, and capitalism defeated him to grow and develop from 1945 to 1971. One could argue that the fascists were simply competing with the other states for dominance in the world system. This, however, is false. Hegemony is the power of one state in the world system to get its way with the others about 95% of the time. However, the interstate system, even under the hegemon, requires that the sovereignty of all states, declared as legitimate under international law, be respected. The hegemon cannot simply wipe out and/or aggress against all the other states. The fascists were not content with hegemony. The nature of their regimes and movements was to constantly aggress against everyone else in the world system, and so neither Hitler nor any other fascist would be satisfied with dominance in the world system.
As Piper just mentioned, the Nazis' ideal world requires creating an anti-capitalist world system, one that rivals business interests. Of course, before this can be achieved, they engage in the world economy, but on their own terms. This reflects their derringistic and even sometimes state control approaches to the market, keeping it within the purview and grasp of party control, and in this way, Nazism could allow the markets to be as free as the interests of rebirthing the national community. This makes the Nazi economy more of a phoenix than a vampire, if we were to use a mythological metaphor to summarize it. This is why any business interests, even military alliances associated with them, had to be from people they considered organic or honorarily organic enough. Anyone outside of this, and in particular those that were Jewish, as they were seen as the primary enemy, got excluded from the market as well as state and military processes. This makes Nazi Germany's capitalist endeavors a transitional phase in retrospect to their ideological goal, which as they began to grow closer to, pursuing aggressive territorial expansion to create and secure the Lebensraum, was building towards a world empire. If achieved, it would have dismantled the capitalist world economy, making the Nazis' goal of total domination anti-capitalist in result. Side note, the use of world systems analysis here is ours and not present in Roger Griffin. Using business leaders in capitalist economics, even if we argue it was transitionary, was considered counter-revolutionary to the Transtracerism. Considering Hitler's rise to power as a half-revolution, as for them a part of the national struggle for rebirth, incorporating a sense of class struggle but along racial lines. In this, the upper class is removed immediately, irrespective of organic membership, and replaced with party officials, creating so-called Reich cooperative chambers to manage the economy. There's much less advantages to be made as an ambitious businessman if party members kill you outright. Even more to the point is the existence of anti-industrial variants of fascism seen in strands of eco-fascism, where the establishment of a rooted modernism is through the collapse of industrial society, where post-industrial, ethnically homogeneous, tribal communities form. It views technological collapse as the catalyst for global palingenesis, either through accelerating it or viewing it as inevitable enough that acceleration is not required. Varg Vikernes' odalism is an example of the latter case, where he views the collapse as imminent, after which the most healthy members of the alternation survive and form neo-tribal pagan communities. The ultimate issue with framing fascism as just capitalism's reaction is that it discredits the unique and autonomous ideological core and revolutionary goals it has, reducing it to a form of vulgar corporatism, or when rich people stop poor people from revolution. This causes an overinflation of the term, where anyone from Bill Clinton to Augusto Pinochet are labeled fascist. It should be noted that fascism is a reaction to capitalism, but more specifically, a reaction to liberal modernism, not simply just capitalism in general, as there needs to be a significant degree of secularization and a weakening of traditional forces for fascism to really take root within the makeup of a country. At the end of the 2020 video on fascism, Bean gave a definition. However, in retrospect, it was terrible, attempting to mix in multiple definitional methods. For those unaware, it was fascism, a far-right ideology and movement aimed at ultranationalist palingenesis through decadence cleansing in order to achieve a return to the mythical primordial nation, in which cultural stillness arises from the pure community's fixed nature, for which exists only in phantasm as a national myth that is recreated by the state's base and superstructure of pan-militarism. Already this is clustered and a mess of jargon, making many of the mistakes just discussed. Roger Griffin's preference for a single-sentence definition is superior to a long-form one, as it's far more accessible and usable. The use of Marxist jargon and being zone only served to confuse and saturate an understanding of this political phenomenon. Its over-reliance on militarism limits the scope of possible variations and denies fascism agency as a potential anti-systemic movement. Viewing fascism as creating cultural stillness also ignores fascism's attempts at creating a future and cultural movement through the concept of rooted modernism.
Before I read Roger Griffin, I had read another historian of fascism, Stanley G. Payne. From his analysis, I synthesized my own definition, nationally vitalist supremacist conservatism. The support for this was that fascism seeks to revitalize the nation while extending the nation's power over groups considered outside it as well as other nations, thereby preventing progressive social change. The problem with this definition is that fascism and conservatism are at odds. Conservatism's main project is to limit progressive social change, whereas fascism explicitly seeks to overturn the old order. My definition also didn't use the principle of methodological empathy, where one actually tries to understand what the fascists are saying in their own words without sympathizing with their goals and conclusions. Not using this principle puts one in danger of only understanding fascism from an outsider's perspective and thereby failing to understand its core ideas and practice.